Very much, Mr. Chair, Major General Asthana, and thanks for inviting me the Indic Research Forum. Uh, I'm delighted to be speaking to you today. And what I have decided is that because of the extensive talks that we had on various aspects of the problem of Bangladesh today, I'm not going to try and repeat what my previous speakers have said. So I will take a slightly different line, and let me start by saying that complex social events like the one that we witnessed in Bangladesh seldom have one reason or uh, one level of analysis. To use Kenneth Walsh's levels of analysis approach, we might be better off saying that what happened in Bangladesh is better understood by looking at multiple levels of analysis. Certainly at the individual leader level, some of the mistakes probably that Sheikh Hasina did, which factored into what finally transpired. You can certainly look at it from the state level analysis, things that happened inside Bangladesh over a period of time, which then eventually translated into street protest and a change of government. But my focus today is actually on the third level, which Kenneth Walsh calls the third image, which is developments at the international systemic level, how they influence what happens inside states and particularly the behavior of states. So I'm restricted by looking at the international system, developments over the last 30 or 40 years in that system, and how that then plays into this idea that international players, particularly big powers, had something to do with the outcome that we are discussing today. So at the very outset, my working hypothesis is that this regime change, which I often talk about in terms of almost a coup that took place, or a putsch, even probably a better word, that happened with the blessings and probably the support of the American state. Some people may use the term the deep state, but certainly American fingerprints over Bangladesh is quite visible to many of us, including myself. So this is my working hypothesis, and what I will try to do is unpack a kind of condensed history over the last 30 years, which probably gives the kind of evidence on which we can reach that conclusion that the US probably had something to do with this. I certainly disagreed with a lot of initial analysis that came in the immediate aftermath of the removal of Sheikh Hasina, that China had something to do with it. I never believed that this is part of China's modus operandi. This actually fits more the kind of things that the US has done over the last 35 years, certainly since the end of Cold War 1.0. So why am I saying this? Why am I saying that the US was instrumental in effecting this outcome in Bangladesh? Now, to understand that, we need to go back a little bit in history. And my starting point here is the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991 and the ending of Cold War 1.0, which certainly did happen. And when this big momentous event happened, America basically transformed itself, according to Michael Mandelbaum, from being just a superpower to now being a hyperpower. American power was unchallenged anywhere in the world. America was clearly the largest power by some distance in the world with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at that moment, when America was converted into this hyperpower, according to Michael Mandelbaum, American political elites reached some sort of a consensus, that American leaders reached a consensus, which many people talk about. The term they use is a Washington consensus. This was a bipartisan consensus. So this was not a Democratic or a Republican Party consensus. This was, across the board. It was bi-party or bipartisan rather. It had the support, or at least the intellectual input, of many American scholars and academics. And this consensus, in a very, very nutshell kind of analytical way, basically was about three things, three fundamental objectives behind the consensus. Number one, that US hyper hegemony, that US is now a hyperpower, not just a superpower, but a hyperpower. This is a hegemonic position of the United States in the international system. This hegemony must be maintained at any cost. So that's number one. Number two, any would-be challenger to America's hegemony. So challengers would emerge presumably from time to time. Any would-be challenger would be ruthlessly neutralized. So absolutely ruthless towards potential challengers. Do not allow challengers to grow big. Neutralize challengers so that this American hegemony can be maintained. And finally, the third thing about this consensus was that when it comes to predominantly the global South, many other states in the system, they must all toe the American line. And if you don't toe the American line, then the consequences would be really, really severe. And it is this aspect of this consensus which then created this idea that we have many smaller countries which are inimical to America's interest. They are not listening to us. So we have a license to go and change the government into a government that would be more pro-America. So this regime change type of foreign policy emerged out of this consensus. But the consensus was very clear. We must maintain hegemony, we must neutralize challengers, and we must have compliant regimes that will toe the American line, that will listen to the American government's position, that will not do anything that would undermine American interest broadly in the global South. Now, you may ask the question, why did this consensus develop and where did it come from? What were the drivers of this consensus? And in my understanding, there were essentially four groups of arguments, four groups of scholars, practitioners, who all agreed on the consensus, but for very different reasons. And I think we need to understand that. The first group talked about America's exceptionalism. So this is America's exceptional moment. America is an exceptional country. Charles Krauthammer, Robert Kagan, some of their writings talked about this, that this has never happened in American foreign policy history. America has never been a hyperpower. This is America's exceptional position in the world, exceptional moment. And this must be preserved. This must be protected. This must be nurtured. Secondly, there were a group of scholars who talked about the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union as the triumph of liberalism and the inevitable spread of liberalism all over the world, and who would lead this revolution across the world. Who else but the United States? So these were like almost democracy crusaders in a sense, liberals in the US establishment, who were talking about the triumph of liberalism and America's destiny in promoting democracy and liberalism all over the world. The classic idea came from Francis Fukuyama when he wrote his book, The End of History and the Last Man, in which he made a case that it is America's obligation, America's mission in a way, almost like a crusading mission, to promote and spread democracy and liberalism all over the world. And for that, America needs to be a hegemonic power. America needs to neutralize illiberal challengers, and so on and so forth. The third driver came from scholars like Samuel Huntington, who talked about this new era, this post-Cold War era, as being a clash of civilizations, that America represents the leadership of the Western world, Western civilization, but there are other civilizations, many of them non-Western, who pose a significant challenge to the Western dominance of the world, the civilizational dominance of the world. And therefore, whether America likes it or not, it is in that moment, in a struggle to maintain this hegemony of Western civilization. Huntington did not see it purely in terms of nation states. He saw it in a much more macro level, much more broader level. But the point is still the same, that America, as the leader of the Western world, must ensure this Western dominance over other non-Western civilizations, which are probably not as good as Western civilization. And finally, a group of scholars, group of practitioners who are fundamentally realists, their argument was that this kind of this kind of exceptional hegemony, this hyperpower that America finds itself, is actually good for America's long-term security, provided America can actually maintain it. And their argument has always been that the best guarantor of security is to occupy the preeminent powerful position in the world, so that you can neutralize any threat to the security that may come from challengers who do not like your overwhelming dominance. So, theorists like John Mearsheimer, Graham Allison at Harvard, these people talked about America's fundamental need to maintain this global hegemony. And they saw that the challenge to that global hegemony would come from two fundamental challenges, one Russia and one China. The other countries are, much lower capacity in terms of challenging America's global hegemony. Russia, obviously, still a very, very big country, tremendous potential in terms of resources, etc. So Russia could become a potential challenger down the track, and so could China, because China, being an authoritarian country, fast developing its economy, modernizing its military, could be that country to oppose America's hegemony. Now, if you bring the story forward a little bit, that to the main game that the United States has played is basically a game. So many of the previous commentators talked about the expansion of NATO, America's interference in domestic politics, etc., etc. All of that has come from these three fundamental things: that we must maintain our hegemony, we must neutralize our challengers, and for the rest of the world, you cannot be impartial, you cannot be neutral. This is basically, as the chair said, Cold War 2.0. You must be either with us or you are against us. And George W. Bush actually framed it brilliantly during the so-called war on terror, when he said, there is no fence sitting in this. You are either with us or you are against us. So we will either treat you as a friend, you toe our line, or you are an enemy who's not listening to us, we are coming after you. And some of that mentality you can actually even see today. For example, as recently as a few weeks ago, America's ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, made the comment, I think very foolishly, that during times of war, there is no strategic autonomy. So in other words, he was saying, on the Ukraine war, we absolutely do not like India not siding with the United States and with the West and with NATO against Russia. And if the Indians come back and say, well, but we have always practiced strategic autonomy, we judge everything on its merit, we go by our national interest, etc., etc., the American interpretation is, no, you cannot do that. You are either with us or against us. So it's a very binary vision of the world. And it is this that then makes America particularly upset with a whole bunch of countries, particularly in the global south, and many of them also democratic countries, where regimes which are in power do not necessarily toe the American line. So it comes down to that third point I made, that you must toe the American line. And if you don't toe the American line, then we don't like it. We are coming after you. We will either invade your country, we will occupy it, or we will do something to throw you out of power. We will have a new regime take over, which will be more compliant with America's interest and America's intentions. And it is this game, this threefold game, that maintain hegemony, neutralize challengers, and everybody else must toe the line. It is this template that you can actually use to understand what America is doing vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. So neutralization of the Russian challenge, and now increasingly the Chinese challenge in Asia, because America sees China as a long-term threat to America's hegemony in the world. Now, one other thing I will say very quickly is that in this game of hegemony and somebody challenging, Graham Allison, he wrote a fantastic book called Thucydides' Trap, in which he talks about the U.S.-China struggle for dominance. I would say that the U.S.-China struggle for dominance is currently restricted to Asia, and the Chinese argument is, which many Chinese scholars have told me, is that the American domination, America as a net security provider in Asia, American domination of Asia is a historical aberration. It happened basically because America dropped two atom bombs on Japan in 1945, as a result of which Japan surrendered unconditionally. And then the history. America wrote the Constitution of Japan, etc., etc. So America became an Asian power after the Second World War as a result of this development, and also the other side, which is that China was a very weak country at that time. China had a civil war going on from 1945 to 1949. And after 1949, when the communists took over, China basically practiced, autarky, turning its back to the world. The state was incredibly weak at that time. It was in no position to challenge America's dominance in Asia. But now that China has become powerful, the Chinese basically want to push America out of Asia, at least, not globally, but at least out of Asia. And it is for this reason why we are facing these problems in Asia. And America's counter to this Chinese effort to push America out of Asia, has been to ring fence China. What my argument is that they are trying to ring fence China, sit on China's border, and it is this ring fencing of China where Bangladesh comes in. So how does this ring fencing work? If you look at the map of China, on the northeastern side of China, America is very, very dominant, present in 5 countries: South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and a little down south in Australia. So Australia has become America's military dump yard. So Australia is basically becoming an American military base, with the entire purpose being that we would have forward presence in case of a war with China, particularly over Taiwan. But America recently signed, several new base agreements with the Philippines. America obviously is in Japan. There's a huge military presence in South Korea, and also, the question of, American military support to Taiwan. So on the eastern seaboard, you could argue that America has ring-fenced China very, very well. And this ring-fencing of China is becoming much more robust. And this fits in with, what President Obama had said, that we are going to pivot to Asia. We are going to deploy most of our naval assets and Air Force assets in Asia. But what is also happening is, in my judgment, an effort by America to ring-fence China in the south. So this is China's southern flank, and the southern flank borders countries like Myanmar, India, Bangladesh, that area, then Bhutan, Nepal, and then far out in the far west, Pakistan, and then Afghanistan. So if you look at the South Asian countries, then Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, Afghanistan become important to ring-fence China from the south. And it is here where the Americans for the last 10 years have really faced a problem. And the problem has been the Modi government. In spite of America's best efforts, Mr. Modi has basically made it very clear that India will not join an American-led alliance against China. So India's interpretation of even the Quad, which India is a part of, is that Quad is not a defensive alliance, a military alliance against anybody, read China. And it is the frustration of this that they have not been able to convince Modi to blanketly join this American effort against China that has frustrated the US administration. And this frustration goes back almost 10 years. This was towards the last few days of the Obama administration, then into the Trump administration, and now Biden administration. And this frustration will continue if Trump comes back to power next year, again, in his second term. And many of you who follow Indian foreign policy would know that America also tried to convince India to become one of NATO's partners from Asia. So NATO has 4 Asian countries as partners of NATO: South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And they tried very much to convince Modi and Jaishankar that India should become a NATO partner. And India has said flatly no. India has said that the Quad is not a defensive alliance. India carries out bilateral, multilateral military exercises, but says that this is not directed at any particular country. So failing to bring India into the camp in a tighter way against China, America's attention is very much directed towards Myanmar. I think the game plan is very clear. America's appointed leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, was deposed by the military junta. Aung San Suu Kyi was basically, America's person in Myanmar, in the guise of democracy and all of that, human rights. But that plan didn't work because she was upset. She was removed in a coup. And now the game plan is that let's try and create disturbances in Myanmar, maybe even break up Myanmar, or at least, American covert operations inside Myanmar with all these ethnic militias and insurgents in that country. And this would allow, perhaps a hypothetical scenario could be if northern Myanmar separates from the rest of the country or becomes a no-go area for the Burmese military, northern Myanmar bordering on southern China would become a staging ground of America's subversive activities against China. And Bangladesh comes in because St. Martin's Island, if you look at the map, it is so close to Myanmar. My sense is that St. Martin's Island, basically America wants in order to build an ISR capability in St. Martin's Island, and perhaps also the staging ground of covert operations into Myanmar. So this is clearly Operation Myanmar. And Sheikh Hasina's problem was that, maybe influenced by Modi, maybe guided by India, Sheikh Hasina was not giving in to this American pressure that you must toe the American line. We are in this big fight with China, you must toe the line. She didn't toe the line. And when you don't toe the line, this is what happens to you. So this is a clear signal. And this kind of a model we have seen in many other cases. I mean, Imran Khan in Pakistan, if you read Jeffrey Sachs argued that he was removed under American pressure because he was simply not toeing the line. So America used Asim Munir, the military, the ISI, to get him out. And they have now got Shahbaz Sharif, who will do whatever the Americans will tell him to do. They tried this in 2014 in Ukraine, that a democratically elected president of Ukraine was driven out of office by American-sponsored street protest, the so-called Orange Revolution, which then brought in undemocratic forces into power in the country and actually empowered a lot of these Ukrainian Nazis, which the Russians talked about, Azov forces and so on and so forth. So something similar has happened in Bangladesh. Yunus is America's person. He's very close to the Clinton Foundation, to Bill and Hillary Clinton. He was decorated by President Obama. America ensured that he got the Nobel Peace Prize for his Grameen Bank and all the rest of it, microfinance and so on. But Yunus, imposition of Yunus there are two things here which are very interesting. One is, how long will this interim arrangement last? According to the military, probably about a year. BNP and the other parties probably want elections before that. Yunus said that this interim government should be at least in power for 3 years. So there is that line of friction opening up in Bangladesh on that. So hopefully the Americans will be able to orchestrate some kind of a compromise there. But the other problem, of course, would be that now that there is a power vacuum in Bangladesh and the economy is tanking, my own sense is that this is going to only empower the Islamists who actually want to create an Islamic Emirate of Bangladesh, very much like Taliban Afghanistan in Bangladesh. They have said it openly. There's no secret about it. Their game plan is that this should become an Islamist country, one of the outposts of the caliphate, because it will be governed by Sharia law and so on and so forth. And in that Darul Islam, there will be hardly any minorities left. Most of the minorities would have to convert, or they will be killed, or they will be expelled. Whether this will set into motion a civil war in Bangladesh, I don't know. That possibly could be. I mean, the Chittagong hill tracts could be an area which could refuse to toe the line, so there could be conflict there. And certainly Western Bangladesh, bordering on West Bengal, where there are a significant number of Hindus, could be another area where there could be trouble. So potentially this could lead to civil unrest in Bangladesh between hardline Islamists and minorities and the rest. Yunus, I don't think probably will last for very long unless America decides that we are better off having a military government in power, or maybe an Islamist government in power, but a government that will actually toe the American line and give America what it wants, etc., etc. So my own take is that what has happened in Bangladesh is a very well orchestrated, well funded, well planned movement, engineered by the United States, by players who are part of the US administration, like Donald Lu and many others. And this is something that is a result of this Washington consensus. So some of you may call it Cold War 2.0, this neutralization of China, neutralization of Russia. And this is something that one needs to understand in order to understand why America has become such a aggressive country globally. And very interestingly, one of the things that has emerged out of this is that America talks the language of a rules-based world, a global world, which is governed by rules agreed by everybody. But America also gives itself the license to break the rules whenever it suits itself. So in this Washington consensus, there are no sovereignty protection for any country. America can intervene, America can do regime change, America can bomb you, America can invade and occupy you, and America will not be restricted by these arguments of international norms, international rules, and so on and so forth. So it's a very paradoxical situation driven by this, and we have to wait and watch how things pan out. And this certainly creates pressure for India, and I think it creates pressure for China as well. I don't think Xi Jinping is very enthused by what has happened in Bangladesh. His intelligence may have given him advance warning, which I think probably what happened when he met Sheikh Hasina in Beijing. Hasina wanted a lot of money. She didn't get it. Xi Jinping actually gave her only 10 minutes of his time, didn't even talk to her properly. And as you know, she came back one day earlier from her China trip, very disappointed that the Chinese didn't want to invest so much in Bangladesh at that time. So maybe Xi Jinping knew something was coming and didn't want to commit himself. It is certainly interesting. I think the previous speaker talked about this, whether Indian intelligence failed in Bangladesh. Did these guys have no idea what was going on? I personally doubt it. I think the Indian government was aware of what America's game plan was. They simply were not in a position to stop it. But now India will have to deal with the fallout of this, and the fallout will not be so nice. So let me stop there. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer.